They told you that slavery in America was only about the South. But what if I told you that rich landowners also owned white slaves? For centuries, history books have overlooked a dark and shocking truth. Thousands of Europeans were kidnapped, sold, and forced into brutal servitude. Some were indentured servants trapped in contracts they could never escape, while others were worked to death under horrific conditions, discarded and forgotten. Why was this history erased? Who didn't want you to know? Stay tuned, because what you're about to learn will challenge everything you thought you knew. This is the untold history they never taught you, until now. History books rarely mention it, but between the 1600s and 1800s, hundreds of thousands of Europeans, mainly Irish, Scottish, and English, were taken from their homes and forced into brutal labor in America. Some were debtors who had no choice, others were criminals sent as punishment, and many, especially the Irish, were kidnapped and sold like property. These people were not simply workers. They were beaten, starved, and forced to work in deadly conditions. Many were shipped to the American colonies and the Caribbean, packed into filthy boats where disease spread quickly. Those who survived the journey were sent to plantations, mines, and farms, where they worked from sunrise to sunset under the threat of whippings and other brutal punishments. Unlike African slaves, some of these laborers were bound by contracts, known as indentured servitude, a system that claimed they could earn freedom after a certain number of years. But in reality, many never escaped. Some were tricked into signing endless contracts, while others died from exhaustion and abuse before they could ever gain freedom. In places like Barbados, white laborers, especially the Irish, were treated so badly that some historians describe their condition as white slavery. They were forced to do backbreaking labor in the sugar fields, exposed to extreme heat, and often worked to death. Some plantation owners even bred white women with African slaves to create mixed-race children they could sell at a higher price. This part of history has been ignored for centuries. While African slavery was far worse in scale and brutality, the suffering of these Europeans was real, and yet their stories were largely erased. So how did this happen? How did thousands of Europeans, many from respectable homes, end up as forced laborers in the New World? The answer lies in a mix of poverty, deception, and outright kidnapping. The idea that Europeans willingly came to America for a better life doesn't tell the whole story. While some came by choice, many were forced, tricked, or outright kidnapped into brutal labor. During the 17th century, England was in chaos. Civil wars, rebellions, and economic struggles left thousands vulnerable. The British government saw an opportunity: ship the undesirables off to the New World to work. Orphans, beggars, criminals, and even political rebels were rounded up and forcibly transported. Irish men, women, and even children were kidnapped from their villages, put in chains, and sold in markets in America and the Caribbean. Some were taken in broad daylight, while others were tricked with false promises of work and land. Once they arrived, there was no escape. For the poor in England and Ireland, survival was a daily struggle. Many desperate people agreed to become indentured servants, signing contracts that promised passage to the New World in exchange for several years of labor. But these contracts were often a trap. Masters could extend them unfairly, and many laborers died before they ever saw freedom. Some were forced to work for 7 years or more, only to be tricked into signing new contracts that kept them enslaved even longer. Shipping off poor Europeans wasn't just a way to get rid of them. It was a business. British merchants and colonial elites made fortunes by selling human labor. Plantation owners needed cheap workers, and white laborers were often cheaper than African slaves at the time. In places like Barbados and Virginia, white workers were worked to death under brutal conditions. This system laid the foundation for forced labor in America, proving that from the very beginning, profit always came before people. For Europeans forced into servitude, life in the New World was anything but a fresh start. Many arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs, only to be thrown into a world of backbreaking labor, cruel punishments, and little chance of freedom. Indentured servants and white slaves were often sent to tobacco, sugar, and cotton plantations, where they worked from sunrise to sunset in extreme heat. In the Caribbean, especially in Barbados, Irish laborers toiled in the sugar fields, facing the same brutal conditions as African slaves. Punishment was severe. Masters could whip, starve, or even brand workers who disobeyed. Some were shackled or beaten for attempting to escape. While both white and African laborers suffered, there were key differences. White servants had a slight chance of freedom after their contract ended, if they survived. African slaves, on the other hand, were enslaved for life, as were their children. Over time, as racial slavery became dominant, white servants were given more rights. while African slaves were stripped of theirs completely. Many indentured servants and white slaves never lived to see freedom. Disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion killed thousands, especially in the Caribbean, where plantation work was deadly. Unlike African slaves, who were seen as a long-term investment, white laborers were often viewed as disposable, cheaper to replace than to keep alive. But as the colonies expanded, plantation owners and lawmakers began to fear the unity between poor whites and black slaves. If they joined forces, they could pose a serious threat to the ruling class. The solution? Laws that separated them by race and ensured that African slavery became permanent. By the late 1600s, laws across the colonies began drawing a sharp line between indentured servitude and racial slavery. In 1662, Virginia passed a law stating that a child's status, free or enslaved, was determined by the status of the mother. This ensured that African slavery would continue for generations. In 1676, after Bacon's Rebellion, where poor whites and black slaves united against wealthy landowners, colonial leaders responded by giving white workers slight advantages, such as small land grants or legal rights, to turn them against black slaves. By 1705, Virginia's slave codes made it clear African slaves were property for life, while white servants, no matter how badly they were treated, would eventually be freed. These legal changes had long-lasting consequences. They not only created the racial divisions that shaped American society, but also erased the memory of white servitude. As racial slavery became the foundation of the economy, the idea of white forced labor didn't fit the new narrative. Over time, history was rewritten to focus solely on black slavery, erasing the shared suffering that once united the lower class. The suffering of white laborers in early America was very real, but over time, it was deliberately erased from history. As racial slavery became the dominant system, the idea of white slaves didn't fit the new narrative. Historians and politicians wanted slavery to be seen as a purely racial system. Black people as slaves, white people as free. The existence of white slaves and forced laborers challenged this idea, so their stories were pushed aside. Wealthy landowners and historians chose to highlight indentured servitude as a temporary hardship, not slavery. They framed it as an opportunity, ignoring the fact that many white laborers were worked to death, just like African slaves. Over time, textbooks focused only on African slavery, leaving out the thousands of Europeans who also suffered. America's ruling class benefited from dividing people by race. If poor whites and poor blacks realized they had suffered under the same system, they might have united against the elites. Instead, history was rewritten to separate their struggles. By erasing white servitude, the powerful ensured that race, rather than class, became the defining issue in America. Even today, the effects of this strategy can be seen in economic and political systems. The working class, regardless of race, has often been pitted against itself, with racial tensions preventing solidarity. Instead of recognizing shared struggles, people are encouraged to focus on their differences, allowing the wealthy and powerful to maintain control. The idea that poor white workers were always privileged compared to black slaves ignored the reality that many of them were also exploited, just in different ways. Over time, this narrative helped prevent any large-scale uprising against those in power. Remembering all forms of oppression is crucial because it helps break this cycle. Acknowledging that white servitude existed doesn't take away from the horrors of African slavery. It simply provides a fuller picture of how the ruling class has always used division as a tool of control. When people see that oppression has never been limited to one race, it becomes easier to recognize the real struggle. Rich versus poor, not black versus white. Understanding this history allows for greater unity among working-class people today. Instead of falling into the same old divisions, people can focus on fighting economic inequality and the systems that continue to exploit the poor, no matter their race. Only by learning from the past can we begin to break free from the cycle of division and oppression that has shaped society for centuries. The truth has been hidden for too long, but now you know. History isn't just about the past, it shapes the present. When we understand how division was created, we can break free from it. Share this knowledge, question what you've been told, and keep learning. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the real history they don't want you to know.